So the next concept is lease term. So what is a lease term? If a contract is or contains a lease, the lease term needs to be determined. Well, the lease term is the non-cancellable period for which a lessee has the right to use an underlying asset plus number one, periods covered by extension option if the exercise of that option by the lessee is reasonably certain. And number two, periods covered by a termination option if the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise that option. So again, the lease term is the non-cancelable period for the lease plus any extension options plus termination options if it is reasonably certain that the lessee would exercise an option. So lessee's termination options. In accordance with IFRS 16, the lease term will be considered to be extended beyond the non-cancelable period if the lessee has an extension option that is that it is considered to be reasonably certain to exercise, or a termination option that it is considered to be reasonably certain not to exercise. So if it has got an extension option which lessee is reasonably certain to exercise, or a termination option which a lessee is not reasonably certain to be to exercise, then the lease term has to be adjusted for those periods. Lessor's termination options. Lessor's right to terminate the lease is ignored when determining the lease term because, in that case, the lessee has an unconditional obligation to pay for the right of the use of asset for the period of lease unless and until the lessor decides to terminate the lease. So, in short, the lessor's termination options is ignored when determining the lease term. At the commencement date, the entity should assess whether the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise an option to extend the lease, or to exercise an option to purchase an underlying asset, or not to exercise an option to terminate the lease. So this you have to determine the lease term at the commencement date. In making these assessments, the entity considers all the relevant facts and circumstances that create an economic incentive for the lessee to exercise or not to exercise the option, including any expected changes in the facts and circumstances from the commencement date until the exercise date of the option. So, in short, so we have to check whether the lessee it by either exercising the option or not exercising the option would receive any economic incentive. So that's the trigger point to determine the lease term. Examples of factors to consider when making these assessments include, but are not limited to, contractual terms and conditions for the optional period compared with the market rate, such as the amounts of payments for the lease in any optional period, the amount of any variable payment for the lease, or the other contingent payments such as payments resulting from termination penalties and residual guarantees, the terms and conditions of any options that are exercisable after the initial optional period. Example, a purchase option that is exercisable at the end of an extension period at the rate that is currently below the market rate. So these optional periods has to be assessed again using the same benchmark as if there is an economic incentive which LSC receives during these optional periods.